Thank you guys for coming today. We're going to go through a lot of case studies and actual science as well behind some pretty interesting points in sports performance and also athlete health. So as a quick introduction, at least for Andrea and I, so both of us began as collegiate athletes and really became peaked interested around these areas of health and performance with all the injuries that were sustained as athletes ourselves. And so as a result, we both went into coaching. And Andrea still remains in coaching at a very high level at Kansas. We've worked with over 80 NBA and WNBA players. And then on my end, I left sports organizations a few years ago to build a startup by the name of Sparta Science to really add technology to some of these problems that we face in sport. When we talk about problems, what we're really talking about is musculoskeletal injuries. Certainly we hear a lot about cancer, cardiovascular issues, things that have pretty severe consequences. But when it comes to musculoskeletal issues, they are by far the largest diagnosis. In the military, for example, 22% of our forces can't be deployed due to this reason. And so across the board, it is a massive problem. And what's interesting is we've spent less than 2% of our healthcare budget on trying to figure out why those are occurring. So we really don't know much, and we're not making a lot of progress in that area. And an example of at least how medicine is working to address some of these issues is we're finding the power behind individualized medicine. And an example is a study looked at 13 patients, and on average of those 13 patients, when they looked at the top 10 medications that were used, those medications work in 1 out of 13 patients. So really what this kind of highlights is even the more basic medications, prescriptions we're using require a much more individualized approach than what we have now. And this is where technology comes into play. When we look at other areas outside of sports and medicine, technology, a good example is the evolutions we've made in communication, going from a Wagner to an iPhone, as an example. And probably most people in this room have gone through physical therapy or have had someone they know go through physical therapy. And so when we look at the technology there, what's been interesting is the advancements haven't been too good. The major test in physical therapy is push into my hands. And that was what it was in 1978, and that's where it is now. And so a very subjective test, it really hasn't been altered over the course of the last 30 years. So why hasn't it been altered, right? Can we actually affect some of these rates that are occurring? In sports, we're going to get into some case studies. We found technology can actually save professional organizations about $12 million a year. When we think about the military, that number is even higher. Right now in 2017, the military spent $1.5 trillion in injuries. And so it's a massive issue. When we talk about healthcare, we've also seen a savings of insurance premiums of almost $1 million a year. And mostly because the severity of issues have decreased so much. Good example, we'll start with sports here as some of these case studies. Good example is the Cleveland Cavaliers. We can share this example now from 2014 in the draft. There were 3 potential players that were going to be the #1 pick, 2 of which played for Andrea at the University of Kansas. And the Cavaliers had a decision to make who they were going to take with the #1 pick. Was it Jabari Parker? Was it Joe Embiid? Was it Andrew Wiggins? And so they were able to use the data not only from University of Kansas, but also the data that they gathered right before the NBA draft. And they ended up taking Andrew Wiggins. And what ended up happening is Jabari Parker's first 2 years didn't play very much, 2 injuries, both to the knee. And Joel actually, first 2 years, didn't play 1 minute. And most of that was from foot injuries, but also subsequently a knee injury. Now the player they did choose, he worked out pretty well. He went on to be Rookie of the Year, and they traded him and actually went to 3 consecutive finals in the NBA. So a lot of this identification of individual movement really is able to highlight the value that's available to us.
When we speak about ground reaction forces and why it's really important, when usually we say ground reaction forces and people don't know what we're talking about. But this is a simple example of how we can look at what a ground reaction force is. Right? So although he's not running, he's not jumping or anything, that momentum from the top or the torso really affected the bottom part of the movement through his feet. And usually people don't pay any attention to what's going on through your feet because they're so far away from your eyes. It's the furthest thing away from your eyes, so why do we even need to pay attention? But it's really, really important. Here's another example of Usain Bolt without ground reaction forces sprinting against two older astronauts. And he loses. Yeah. So he's not the fastest man, right? When you eliminate ground reaction forces. So ground reaction forces and measuring through a force plate are really, really important to us and how we look at movement. Even if you're a swimmer, you know, it's important how you hit the wall. It's important how you jump off the block. So this is an example too. I studied a little bit of resonance frequency for my grad degree, and everybody operates at their own frequency depending on strength levels, limb lengths, stiffness, mobility, all these different things. And I'm going to show you here real quick what I look at in a basketball game. Not that I don't care if the ball goes in the hoop, but what's really important for me is how they're moving. So this example here, I want to see if you guys see anything. Now that 5-second clip, there's a lot of things that speak to me here, right? So if we can look, right there, Perry Ellis, he's increasing ground reaction forces by wiping his feet. So he artificially is increasing ground reaction. Right? Just simply wiping his feet. Now we have one of the most pristine floors in America in terms of basketball, but yet he still feels the need to wipe his feet because Perry actually needs to increase that reactability. The next example is Landon Lucas jumping up and down. Now he's trying to increase stiffness in his system, and he's trying to become stiffer just in that time frame right before the jump ball. Now he's been doing that, you know, the whole time pre-game to increase that stiffness or increase frequency, and he's trying to increase stiffness through his core and total body. And then you have the three guys that are actually playing in the NBA right now, not really doing anything. And you talk about talent and how we can manipulate these ground reaction forces by just simple things. And that's why we think the force plate technology is really important. So this is a jump scan. The force plate is right there on the floor. Athlete gets on. They use their arms. The force plate or the software signals to jump. The athlete jumps. I don't know if you saw, but the athlete, it might be a rotational athlete. Did you see how they landed? Kind of a little bit to the sideways, so they actually rotate, and that's really natural for them, for that to happen. So he steps on the plate, he jumped, and then we get some raw data from that.
And so some of the things that we look at is we look at how the individual initiates force. This is the highest in offensive linemen, as a great example, and the most imbalanced, because if you don't initiate force well, you've got a big problem. At least the people behind you have a big problem, right? And the other piece we see really high in is Solomon scares. You're staying in a squat position for a very extended period of time. And so these type of individuals that basically squat for a living is where we see this value, what we call load, very high. And it's really, if you think about it, like a spring being compressed. And how heavy and strong is that spring? The second of the three variables we look at is how well that spring releases. And we see this high in basketball players, mostly soccer, anybody who's quick. And the third variable, think about this spring like more of a slinky. We see this a long force production, what we call drive. We see this high in athletes that don't have to react. They control the tempo, they control the frequency. Golfers, pitchers. And we call this the drive component. And actually this component has actually enabled us to predict an elbow injury from a jump. really because there's a pitching rubber out on the mound for a reason, and we'll go through how that relates. And so we take those forces and we put a number on it. And so there's the raw data coming out, and we're actually put a number where they fall compared to their peers, based on their age, their ethnicity, and it really provides a strong stabilization of where each of these values sit on a bell curve. And so we'll take all these forces. Once they're given a number, we'll throw in, okay, where do some of these injuries occur? How old are they? What's their ethnicity? Where are they from? Other things, how's their heart rate? What's their injury history? So all these factors create a much more clear picture for the individual. And what's interesting in sports is most people think that, you know, sports, at least from a technology standpoint, is super advanced and you're using all this data. There's one real problem in sports. They don't like to share, you know. And in medicine, for example, one hospital, one clinic is never going to have enough of a disease to just rely on their data. And so they share across clinics, across hospitals. And they don't see it as competitive. Now, sports, on the other hand, they don't want to share with anybody. And they feel they have such a competitive advantage around data, when the real advantage is how you use that data. So if we look at sports, an average basketball team will have about 1.3 knee injuries a year. So that means if they don't share, they'll be able to predict injuries in 74 years, right? And so that's a real problem, right? And so when we think about it, like, you know, a good example is on some of these teams, the Caps who we work with, you know, that's about 30 coaching staffs in 74 years, right? And so there's a lot of challenges, you know, with sports being so insulated with each other.
So here's a great example of how we affected Jeff Whippy, who ended up being a Defensive Player of the Year in the NCAA. When we tested Jeff the first time, he came from Southern California. He was a volleyball player, where he needed to prolong force production and use timing and momentum to play volleyball. So that was his scan, how he loaded into the ground, how he exploded out in that drive was really big, but that's not great for a basketball player because you don't have time to react. You know, if you did have time, you know, the game would be a lot slower. So what we needed to realize was that we needed to change his scan because he had a huge injury risk with a difference of more than 15. So we knew we had to bring that drive down and increase the load and explode so we could make him a little bit more reactive. We did another sway test too. So that sway test, that measures his balance. So really if he's really strong, he can hold his posture and his balance and he doesn't sway as far left and right on a one-legged test. So this is another test besides the vertical jump that we can get some good performance measures from. So Jeff's scan is up there on that top left, and then we had to turn it into the scan on the right. Now how did we do that? We did it with bilateral movements and heavy weights. He was tall, right? And most people say, oh, he's tall, he shouldn't squat, he shouldn't deadlift, he's gonna hurt his back. Right, but we turned him into the Defensive Player of the Year just by having an exercise prescription designed exactly for him. The things that we didn't want to do were the things that he was good at. The long jumps like a volleyball player, because he's already good at them. We don't need to make him any better, and it didn't make him a better basketball player. It made him a good volleyball player. And then also like sled drags, where he could take as long as he wanted. So we needed to load him up. Specifically for him to change that reactability.
And so what we saw with Jeff is really the knee tendon became his injury. And so if we look at the knee tendon from jumping, we'll see it right on that patella bone. And so instead of actually bending the knee, that tendon became extremely inflamed from jumping. And if we think back to that load portion, that first bar where you're actually compressing that spring, we're able to pick that out from jumping. In fact, machine learning is able to identify what thresholds on a jump we're able to predict a knee injury for Jeff. You know, the most important piece is what can we do about it? If we look about fitness and wearables, there's a lot of information out there that we get. And the next question, which is not being answered enough right now, is so what? So I walk 10,000 steps, so what? Do I need 8,000? Do I need 15,000? And what's that really doing for me? And so we have to look at movement in a way similar to medicine. If we take, a squat, for example, and looking at it the same way as we would what type of medicine, what's the class as an antibiotic? We have to look at what type of antibiotic, and ultimately how is that antibiotic given? And what we find is this system starts to work to change the individual and is very scientific about how much and when. And we've approached it very much like low back pain. Low back pain can be anything from cancer to a mental concern all the way to an actual musculoskeletal injury. So there's a lot of causes in between. So the best approach is working backwards. Once we know how that individual can improve themselves off force, right, we're able to start classifying some of these things into distinct movement patterns, what we call signatures.
So as Jeff, being a volleyball player and having a history of volleyball and having a history of knee pain, his scan looked like that when we got him. And those are those long, drawn-out muscle contractions, waiting for that ball, and timing and momentum are really, really important in some specific positions in sport, within different sports, right? So another one is that stiff, that's like that long, lean, there's a lot of body typing stuff to it, long, lean, efficient, almost effortless movement that comes with that stiff scan. And then the next scan is a rotational scan that you have to have an ability to accelerate, decelerate, but also create a whip through your torso. So not everybody needs great or high levels of core strength. Those guys don't express their movement well running and jumping, but boy, can they create a really good rotational whip. And then the last one is a lateral mover. Frank Mason, in my 25-year career as a performance coach, Frank Mason was the only NCAA Player of the Year. Out of the 50 NBA guys that I've worked with, Frank was the only one, and his scan was very similar to the one on the bottom right, which is a mesomorphic kind of guy. So there's a lot of body typing to do with this. Long, lean, you got the endomorph, you got the ectomorph. So Frank had a lot of muscle. He also needs a lot more recovery. With more muscle, that requires a lot more recovery than most people. Very different than Andrew Wiggins, didn't need as much recovery as Frank. But this was Frank's scan when he came to Kansas. And what's really interesting about Frank is he wasn't a great basketball player his freshman year. Now he stood out super as an athlete, right? There's a lot of times where you ever see the NASCAR races, those cars go really, really, really fast, but then they stop in the pit. They get new tires, they get rotated, whatever, but that doesn't really happen in sports. So recovery is really, really important for especially those mesomorphic athletes. So we knew what we had to do with Frank was bring down that load to create a more even force scan that lowered his injury risk. So with Frank, we had to create tension over time. Derrick Rose always gets hurt because he's always twerking and jerking, when he's going to the rim. It might be too much force, too soon. So what we have to do is prolong those muscle contractions over time. And instead of doing like short, quick things that he was good at, Frank could have cleaned probably 350 pounds or squat 500. Why do more of that? Because then that increases his opportunity to get hurt. So what we had to do were single leg things that prolong force production, or overhead things that prolong force production with a great range of motion, and he's opened up. So Frank's scan is very different than Jeff's, and they were on two very different exercise prescriptions that helped them stay healthy and increase performance over time. So what was important with Frank too was the consistency over 4 years. Now athletes, if you've ever worked with athletes, some are really inconsistent. You never know who you're going to get on a given day. They could be a different person, different personality. They could be not recovered. They could be recovered. You don't know who you're going to get. But what was cool was Frank was like a robot with a personality. It was the same guy. He had constant effort. He took care of his nutrition. He slept well. He just brought it every day. The effort was the same. And it actually we could actually then predict his performance. And with this one, he was 79% free throw shooter, and that's just one variable that we looked at. And the NCAA average was 69, so he was above average, very consistent, versus someone else who was a utility player over a 5-year span, right? You never know who you're going to get on a given day. Not predictable. Utility player, used him when we needed to, and his free throw percentage was a little bit lower. But you talk about really at emotion, and emotion, we can pick up the emotional state of somebody, I think, on force plate, because it measures 1,000 hertz per second.
So one of the studies that we found is that we can actually predict the amount of minutes played for individuals based on their signature. And not only does it vary by sport, but also varies by gender. And so what we found is that stiffer signature, where somebody's moving much more quickly, that explode variable, that predicts how many minutes a basketball player is able to play. Now, from a female standpoint, it's a little bit different signature because that first variable load is actually a protective mechanism for the knee. And so very similar to that initial slide, talking about prescriptions and individual approaches, we're actually able to start differentiating movement needs off gender, age, and sport. And another key piece is fatigue monitoring. So University of Texas we work with, they're using, these same type of things to identify, okay, how many minutes played do we want in each individual involved in the game? And that's going to vary. In the same way that soccer, for a different risk pattern, will be looking at, okay, how many minutes should each individual play, and how is that changing over the course of the season? Now, when this initial force production is low on a jump, it's one of the largest predictors in the research for an elbow injury. So you can do a jump and be able to predict an elbow injury in 60 seconds. And so the Rockies and other Major League Baseball teams are using it to hone down on what is the pinch count for each individual. Rather than just guessing and saying, okay, 100 pitches is the limit for everyone, it's slightly different for each person based on their movement. The other piece, from a football standpoint, is how many snaps are being played. And how do we able to predict, okay, when are ACL and foot issues start to rise up? Particularly with linemen, which are one of the more coveted positions because they protect the rest of your roster or assault the rest of your roster if we're talking about defensive linemen. So looking at that piece, we know what an ACL looks like. We know what a lineman looks like in the NFL. We're faced with this dilemma of, similar to Icarus, how much do we want to enhance performance, yet still putting the individual at risk? How close to the sun do we want to fly? And the technology is used at the combine, and one of the ways it's used at the combine is very similar to the FICO score. So when you go see a loan officer and they decide if you get a loan and how much, they're taking into account a bunch of factors that roll up into one score. So we've taken force, their injury history, each individual, and teams will use this for that one score for a decision tree. And a more scientific example of how this works is they will take that one score for an individual. There's a real case study for a defensive back, a cornerback in the NFL, and they will say, okay, is he a lineman? And the answer is no. Well, is his score above 86? Or is it above 88? And we're able to say, okay, this individual has a 67% chance of being injured. And those kinds of statistics, even at a high level, that 87 number, general managers, owners, coaches, scouts, they'll use this to hedge their bets of who's more likely to develop, who's more likely to be injured, and so on.
So this was a basketball player with a rotational scanner, a guy that could create that whip. And again, that individual or that athlete doesn't express their force production well running and jumping because they lose that stiffness through their core. So they kind of lose that energy production, and again, they don't jump and run really well. But can it work as a basketball player? Absolutely, because he was a really good timing athlete. He had skill. He wasn't athletic, but again, he was highly skilled. So we made him healthy to play basketball. And what we needed to do, if I was a better strength coach, I guess, increase that explode above 51 and raise that a little bit more. So some of the work that we had to do, so we tested his plank sway, which measured core strength from from the head to the groin or even knees, and you just stabilize, and it measures how much you sway. And if you can't stabilize, that sway increases, and we know that we have a low explode athlete.
And so what we're able to find is actually, through some of the work that Hudy's done, we're able to stabilize the core, the back, and groin, but at the same time, it becomes predictive of concussion, particularly in female athletes, where that neck strength is diminished. Because at the end of the day, not every concussion is occurring helmet to helmet. It's also occurring because of the lower ability to control the head position. And so as that plank position gets below a certain level, in this case 48, it's an indicator of a neck strength or neck control being diminished. We've actually been able to use this as a clearance for return to play on concussion.
So with Landon, what we had to do to try to get rid of that lack of core strength or to increase core stability was anti-rotation things, things that he was really on his knees and eliminating lower leg. And then the things that he was good at were full ranges of motion and full squats and all these things. He was pretty good at them. But what we needed to do was really stabilize from knees to shoulders.
And I think we alluded to this at the beginning. The interest for Andrea and I really started as a personal one, shocked at the level of technology and data that's used to identify injuries and even improve health, particularly from a movement standpoint. As athletes ourselves, I mean, the two of us together are rather concerned about the future, at least personally, with so many injuries that are already causing pain. Andrea, mostly from a volleyball standpoint, mine mostly from a football standpoint. And how is that going to affect our population as we continue to ignore or at least delay the findings of how to address some of these issues?